Hello everyone, Silent K here. We've got a new expansion on the horizon. Shadowverse's 6th expansion named Starforged Legends, a 104 card new set, and the release date is September 28th, just about 3 weeks away. Before we get started, a quick rundown of my scoring system. This does confuse people sometimes, but I do not score based on meta viability. I feel there are enough people in Shadowverse that play off-meta decks that it wouldn't be fair to rate cards poorly if they're good for off-meta decks but not good for meta decks. So I score based on power level and utility. A score of 0 is right in the middle. It usually means that a card is average power level and typical utility, or there could be some sort of trade-offs like low power level with a decent amount of utility and they average out to 0. But typically 0 would be like an average card. Anything negative of 0 is below average power level, or it has utility that's not very useful or is redundant with another card, generally worse than existing cards, and opposite of that, any positive score is above average power level, or it has a new type of utility that's very useful. Generally they're going to be better than existing options, and generally your top tier meta decks are going to be your +1 and +2 cards. So bear that in mind. So let's jump right into the new cards, going in order of class with neutrals last. First up for Bloodcraft is Gunlod, 7 mana 4/7, Clash, gain +3/+0, deal 2 damage to your leader if Vengeance is not active for you. So this is a vanilla stats minion for 7 mana that only gains 1 stat over normal power curve with the Clash ability. If you're attacking face with it, it's below power curve. It's bad for aggro decks due to the cost and Clash ability not working on face. And it's bad for slower decks because you want more powerful effects from your late game cards. It's not going to see play in any deck. Overall, -2. Next, Uriel, 4 mana 2/3, Bane, Ward, Fanfare, give an allied Bloodcraft follower resistance to targeted enemy spells and effects. This is one of Medusa's big sisters, and it's a pretty good package of effects. Ward plus resistance will make it extremely difficult for your opponent to deal with something you're trying to protect that's already on the board. Aggro might use it to protect something like Vania or Urias, but Control will probably want to stick with Righteous Devil for the Bane and Drain combo. Overall though, not bad. +1. Next, Venom Fae Medusa, Legendary, 4 mana 3/3, Fanfare, summon a Serpent. At the start of your turn, if at least 2 allied Serpents are in play, 2 Serpents combine to become Medusiana. And evolve, you also gain a second Serpent. A Serpent is just a plain 1/1 token, and Medusiana is a 1/7 with Russian Bane, can attack up to 3 times per turn. First note the rarity of the tokens. Typically if a token is only generated by 1 card, its rarity matches the card that generates it, such as Otohime's Bodyguard, Coco and Mimi, Skystride Raptor, etc. Since the Serpent is bronze, there's a possibility that more cards will generate Serpents that we haven't seen yet. So it's a little difficult to fully evaluate this card. For now, let's just assume it's reasonably easy to generate Serpents though. Medusiana seems like an okay board clear, but if your opponent has stuff to clear, they're likely dealing with your Serpents in the meantime. Her ability to attack 3 times per turn is pretty good for aggro though. If you can push Serpents onto the board, keep your opponent tied up, and end up with a Medusiana on the board, you can buff her for some serious damage the turn after she comes into play. Overall, I have to give it a question mark right now until we find out if there are more cards that summon Serpents and how good or bad those cards are. But right now I'm leaning towards a 0 or a +1. On to Dragoncraft, Draconic Singer, 5 mana 4/4, Fanfare, subtract 1 from the cost of a Dragoncraft card in your hand. It's a smaller and more adorable Wyvern Cavalier. Wyvern Cavalier doesn't see any play these days, since ramping is a lot more reliable than reducing the cost of cards. If there were a specific type of combo deck that required cost reductions to enable a combo, you could include Draconic Singer or Wyvern Cavalier depending on your needs. But in general, this isn't going to see any real play. Overall, -1. Next, Python, Legendary, 10 mana 8/9, Fanfare, banish all cards that cost 7 play points or less from your deck. In general, the idea is to clean out your deck so you only have your late game cards left. Typically though, you don't want to add high cost cards in order to accelerate drawing into your win conditions. since that increases the mana curve of the deck and it's not flexible in the early and mid game. Normally you simply want to include card draw in the deck. This allows your deck to remain flexible, it keeps the mana curve down, and it also accelerates drawing into that win condition that you really need. Python does have some uses though. If you watched my videos featuring my 40% of the time it wins all the time deck, you simply swap out Dragon Council for Python and that buffs the win condition to 100% of the time it wins all the time. Now that's a spicy meme. Overall, since it does offer some unique utility, I'll give it a 0. Next, Prime Dragon Keeper, Legendary. Both Dragon Legendaries in a row in the first review. How do you like that? 3 mana 1/5, can't be attacked if Overflow is active for you. Whenever an allied Dragoncraft follower that originally cost 3 play points or less comes into play, deal 2 damage to a random enemy follower and 1 damage to the enemy leader, if Overflow is active. So, when played on curve, it's slightly overstated, but the stat distribution isn't great. Once Overflow is active, however, it has some fairly serious benefits for a 3 mana card. It's probably not a card you want to build the entire deck around, since it would require ramping for overload, as well as dumping a bunch of small followers for damage. But it could be a decent support card. I'm leaning towards 0, but I can almost see this having some real potential, so I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt, and give it an overall +1. On to Forestcraft, Aperia, 5 mana 5/4, Fanfare, gain ambush until the end of your opponent's turn. It's a bigger and less adorable Underbrush Beast Girl. It's not bad, but Forest really doesn't have any single target buff decks. It usually prefers to give a small buff to the entire board of fairies or pump up roaches or something like that. Still, you could follow this up with an Evolve and a Fairy Dancer or Elf Knight Cynthia and swing for 8 damage the turn after you play it. So even though it doesn't synergize with Forest decks all that well, the power level is fairly decent, so overall 0. Next, Elf Song, 2 mana spell, put 2 fairies into your hand. Give all allied followers +1/+1 if at least 2 other cards were played this turn. So it's a fairy circle with trade-offs. Fairy Circle curves better in the early game, since you really want that turn 1 Fairy Circle, turn 2 Fairy plus Fairy, and turn 3 Ancient Elf. But Elf Song can be better in the mid and late game. Which card you want to run will probably depend on the type of deck you're playing. Neither one is strictly better than the other, so overall 0. Next up, Cassiopeia, Legendary, 6 mana 3/3, Fanfare, deal 1 damage to a random enemy follower X times. X equals the number of cards in your hand. This one is a trade-off with Elf Tracker. It has less stats for more damage. Elf Tracker doesn't see play, but Cassie does have more potential. Being able to ping a lot more times mean that she's flexible single target and multi-target removal. And at 6 mana you're guaranteed to have an evil point as well, so if you miss a critical target you can always evolve in a pinch. The 6 cost slot is pretty competitive in mid-range forest decks, but this could fit into a control deck pretty easily. Overall +1. On to Havencraft, Red Hot Boots, 2 mana amulet, countdown 3, Fanfare, deal 3 damage to an enemy follower. Last words, deal 1 damage to a random enemy follower. This kind of has trade-offs with Blackened Scripture. On the plus side you do bonus damage when the amulet pops, and on the minus side you aren't able to banish anything. But being able to banish things like Ayala or Shadowcraft's early game followers is extremely useful. Shadowcraft and Dragoncraft would have to fall completely out of the meta for this to replace Scripture. So overall -1. Next up, Star Torrent, 3 mana spell, deal 1 damage to all enemy followers, subtract 1 from the countdown of all allied amulets. It's Angelic Barrage with a benefit. In general, Angelic Barrage doesn't see much play anymore, but this does synergize with Rush and Storm amulets, basically giving them +1/+0 for the turn if you need to use them to clear followers compared to other countdown reducing cards. It's not super useful, but it does have a chance to see some play. So overall 0. Next, Andromeda, 2 mana 2/2, evolve, none of your other followers can be damaged this turn. It's a semi-unique utility, but it does require you to have a board and for you to want to protect that board. Most Haven followers get value out of hand. Alana Haven is the only deck that really wants to build a board, but with Alana Haven, if your followers survive a turn, you tend to want to just buff them up like crazy. And the main question is, does Andromeda offer any benefit over Athena? Because if she doesn't, then people would be playing Athena right now instead, and I don't really think that she does. She's cheaper, so she comes in a turn or two earlier, but she also requires an evolve, and she doubles as a vanilla 2-drop, but I don't think the utility is all that useful. Overall, -1. On to Runecraft, Starseer's Telescope, 1 mana amulet, Earthright, draw a card, and recover 1 play point. I don't know why they felt this needed the parenthesis text. It's literally just telling you the rule for Earthright. There's no situation where you can activate an Earthright without already having an allied Earth Sigil in play, so that's a bit of unnecessary text. But anyway, it's a free cycle if you already have an Earth Sigil on the board, and it's a Commence Experiment if you don't. It's also better than Commence Experiment in a Hulking Giant deck since it's an Earth Sigil in your hand as well. It's decent, but not really a game changer. Overall, 0. Next, Lightning Lancer, 4 mana 4/3, evolve, deal 3 damage to an enemy follower. Runecraft finally gets a basic 4-drop evolve for board control. Levi is still better in most cases though. He's 1 less mana, 1 less stat, and he has spell boost synergy. This card is only slightly better if you're playing it as a vanilla 4-drop. Overall, it's utility that Rune doesn't really have a lot of access to, but it still feels a bit weak, so -1. On to Shadowcraft, Dark Blade Fiend, 5 mana 3/5, ward. At the end of your turn, use Necromancy 2, deal 2 damage to a random enemy follower. This card has decent stats and ward, and it has a decent damage to shadows ratio. Undying Resentment also does 2 damage for 2 shadows, and it used to see a lot of play until it got outclassed. And the other Shadowcraft followers that deal damage with Necromancy charge a lot more for the effect. So on the plus side, Shadowcraft doesn't have a lot of good options for this type of effect. But on the minus side, this card doesn't really synergize with meta Shadowcraft decks. It's not bad though, so overall 0. Next, Andromeda, 2 mana 1/2, last words, draw a card. Evolve, give all the followers in your hand, last words, draw a card. RIP Skullcradle Widow, she can finally join her love in the afterlife. This is a direct upgrade to a card that already sees play, so there's not much more that needs to be said about it. It does only gain +1/+1 when evolved, but the effect is pretty insane. So overall, +2. Onto Swordcraft, Lord General Romeo, 3 mana 2/3, ward. Whenever you play a commander that originally cost 3 play points, and if this follower costs 3 play points, change this follower's cost to 2 until the end of the turn. So the idea is that it's a 2/3 ward for 3 on curve, and a 2/3 ward for 2 in the mid or late game if you combo it with a 3-cost commander. It's not terrible in theory, but there are only a couple of cards that this can actually work with. First, you need to have a commander that originally costs exactly 3 play points. Fencer is good if you have something you want to buff already on the board, but she's not so good if you don't. Navy Lieutenant, Captain Lechia, and White Paladin all provide some kind of protection, which is doubling up on the utility of this card. And Cinderella has anti-synergy with this card, so those cards aren't really great. It's pretty good with Pompous Princess, since it puts a ward in front of the weaker cards. So overall, it would be okay-ish in an aggro deck if you're running Pompous Princess, or in a type of ward sword deck if you're just running massive amounts of ward. But you're probably still going to be better off with Grimnir for your 2/3 ward for 3. It's a very, very niche card, and I'm not even sure the niche exists for it. So overall -1, and that's kind of being generous. Next, Perseus, 1 mana 1/2, evolve, gain +1/+0 and ward if there are at least 4 allied Swordcraft followers in play. It's Vanguard with trade-offs. If you're running Vanguard, you're probably running an aggro sword deck, so you want your early drops to be officers, so that they can receive officer buffs. This also doesn't synergize with support cannon swords since you need 4 other followers on board. The very fact that you need 4 other followers of any kind on board, and please note that Council of Card Knights does not count, all the tokens are neutral, kinda makes it difficult to get value out of it. It's not difficult for Sword to fill the board, but to fill the board as well as to have 1 mana to spare and an extra evil point to spend on this makes it a pretty rare scenario. This does get an overall score of 0, but that's only because the typical power level for a 1-drop is a 1-mana 1/2, and you really can't expect more than that, so.
My name is Ben Brode, I got a story to tell.
It's rather difficult to make a 1-drop that gets a negative score. Next, Lux Solar Lancer, 2-mana 1/2. Fanfare, put a random commander that costs 5 play points or less from your deck into your hand. Enhance 4. Then put a random commander that costs at least 6 play points from your deck into your hand. Holy fetch card, Batman! It does more than Maid Leader does, and it has +1 stats. You could say that Maid Leader is still better if you're only running high cost commanders. However, every deck runs Albert and Luminous Mage at the very least, so Lux just stomps all over Maid Leader. She's also equally adorable, so rip Maid Leader. Overall +2. On to the neutral cards. First up, Mr. Full Moon, 6-mana 3/3. Fanfare, randomly change the attack of one of the strongest enemy followers in play to 1. Well, the anti-Aegis tech has arrived. It's also pretty decent in general. On turn 6 you're guaranteed to have an evo point, so you can neuter your opponent's largest threat and then evolve to kill a secondary threat. Not bad. Overall +1 for new utility. Next, XP the Flan, 2-mana 2 wait a minute. No, that's not right. Evlesia the Fallen, that's better. 2-mana 2/1. Fanfare, deal 1 damage to the enemy leader. You would only ever play this card in an aggro deck, and I think even an aggro deck would prefer the flexibility of being able to ping a follower with Lyrial or Angel of the Word. If you're going to play an aggro deck, you're probably going to pick a class that has better tools than this. So overall -1. Next, Helb Lindy, 5-mana 5/5, enhance 7. At the end of your turn, deal 2 damage to a random enemy 2 times. First of all, I don't really know whether this card has a one-time proc that deals damage at the end of the turn you play it, or whether it gains the card text permanently. There aren't really any examples of enhance being used this way in the past. It should be permanent since it doesn't specify at the end of this turn, but the localization team has been known to make errors with word choice before, so I will assume it's a permanent effect, but it does seem a bit weak for 7 mana. This is a Hearthstone card that can hit face or followers, so you're not really guaranteed to kill the thing you want, even if it's the only thing on the board. And even in a neutral craft deck, the 5-cost slot is pretty competitive, so you're probably going to have better options to choose. Overall -1. And finally, the poster card for the set. Zodiac Diamond, Legendary, 7-mana 5/5. Fanfare, put a follower that originally cost 7 play points or less from your hand into play and destroy it. Deal X damage to a random enemy follower. If no enemy followers are in play, deal X damage to the enemy leader. X equals the attack of the destroyed allied follower. So you're paying 7 mana for a 5/5, which basically means you're paying 2 mana and a card to deal X damage to a random enemy follower, or face, which is pretty worth it as long as you can guaranteed kill something. This does have additional synergies if you're running Last Word followers though. This could be like a neutral Nephthys for a Dark Alice deck. Ultimately, the best synergies are going to lie with Shadowcraft for obvious reasons, and they already have a lot of ways to activate Last Words. But it does bring some unique utility to the table for other classes as well. So overall +1. And that's all for now. Hope you all enjoyed the video. Please feel free to leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and tune in again next week for the next card review.